led them to that point. But so there is good and bad in a relative sense, and that's here. We experience it. Once we tell a lie, we can assume, well, that's not a good thing to do. We can lie to ourselves. We can lie to other people. So we can experience that in ourselves. We do that ourselves, and we don't need to look any further to recognise there is that duality in a sense of good and bad. So the other thing that I could say after that, which is kind of really my opinion in a way, but from looking at spending a long time looking into these things, I think it's an opinion that is based on a lot of research and evidence that I've uncovered, and so I think there is this idea. If we look at a lot of things online, or particularly online, where you get a lot of this information, things to do with the 60s, to do with the Beatles, to do with the Tavistock Institute or mind control. I'm a bit skeptical about where some of those people are getting their information or where they're going or what the agendas there are. But I think there's a lot that suggests the whole thing is a mind control thing. The whole 60s, Renaissance was something like that. And I don't really buy that argument. But what I do think does happen is, something organic can grow out of. So we have this trauma, as you said, or this spiritual crisis, or this world crisis, the war, and things came out of that, which were technological advances, freedom. We had time, we had money, we had the sense that war is something that we really should try and avoid to all costs. So we have all of those things, and so like technology can be great, but then if it becomes like used in the wrong way, or if we create, for example, a consumer culture just to keep that going, and then that's manipulated by certain groups of people who want to make a lot of money, or they realize certain things have an influence on the culture, or they use advertising to penetrate your unconscious, and they think things are, they have this power over us, which bypasses their own free will in a sense. So these are kind of negative aspects of that. But something organic grew out of World War II, and that is the fact that technology came, freedom came, these things came. So I think with the 60s counterculture, or whatever way you want it, or just the pop culture of that period, I think it was very organic and very positive in the sense that, if you look at those early groups, some people might think they're manufactured and things like that, but the sense of joy and, just the sense of being alive is something, it's very kind of young, innocent, nearly teenage kind of feel to it, because that's what it is, and that's the teenager kind of grew out of that. So it's no surprise that it's like that, and I definitely, in my book and the girl groups, I kind of talk about that. There's tremendous innocence from those girl groups, 63. Not completely innocent, but there's a sense of innocence, a sense of something new, a sense of excitement. The songs express that. There's no labouring over the writing of the songs. And I think that's the same with a lot of these early 60s groups, groups that came around in the early 60s. Just a kind of a freshness, a newness, a thing of something that it doesn't seem too laboured or too thought about. It just comes about organically. And I think if you compare that to music, popular music today, there seems to be a lot more. It's thought about a lot more. It's marketed a lot more. It's the manufacturing of it is very different type than it was back in the early 60s. And I think you can see a very clear progression of those people, those young people, that group, who are writing these songs, who were around at the time. They start to evolve and grow, and suddenly the music goes from being a very innocent teenage kind of very much about love and relationships, which is what teenagers find themselves in at that stage, at that early teens. It grows into something a little bit more thoughtful, a little bit more introspective, and then that moves into something a little bit more kind of revolutionary and confrontational by the end of the 60s. And it nearly kind of charts the whole period of your teenage life, I think, you know. You start off kind of innocent teenagers discovering girls and boys or whatever, then you kind of get a little bit more, adolescence comes along, you get a little bit more introspective, and then kind of rebellious by the end of it. You know, by the time you're 16 or 17, you're wanting to leave home, or you know, that kind of thing.
Yeah, you have to emancipate yourself from your parents. You have to.
Looking good, feeling good, and making a world of difference, one bottle at a time. Care for your hair and the planet with Elvive from L'Oréal Paris. All our shampoo and conditioner bottles are now made from 100% recycled and recyclable plastic, except the caps, which we're still working on. Together, we can save 5,000 tonnes of virgin plastic a year. For more information, see l'oreal-paris.co.uk/Elvive Recycle.
And separate yourself from your parents. We got to take a little commercial break here. We're with Sean MacLeod. The book we're talking about today is Behind the Wall of Illusion. Now, you can get this book over at this website in Ireland called limerickWritersCentre.com. And that center is spelled CENTRE. And I'll have a link. The link will be up on the blog and on the website. Sean, right before we went to the break, you were saying about how, and I hate to back up too much, but you were saying about how this idea that, because you hear these people talk about how the Beatles were created at Tavistock, right? And I've heard this so many times, and I've tried to look it up, and I had people come on the show and talk about Tavistock, but exactly, and you don't subscribe to that, do you?
No, so I guess not to the extent that a number of people do. I guess just to finish off what I was saying before is that certain things come about which are spiritual forces. You know, they're quite positive, very 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 active, very they're powerful, but they're positive spiritual forces. But of course, that always has its shadow side. And you might consider the shadow side. I mean, you might consider it to be, you know, by the mid '60s, you suddenly had a very, you know, you'd marijuana and you'd LSD and things, which changed the nature of the music. It changed the nature of personalities of those people making the music, and it changed the nature of the culture as well, particularly in the Western world, America, Britain, and those places. But that shadow side is very important as well, you know. The shadow side is something we need. It's part of who we are as human beings, because that shadow side allows us to look inward. It allows us to ask questions and then to challenge things that we thought before. So that's what happened with marijuana and LSD. It became, you know, we looked inwards. But also caused an awful lot of destruction as well. You know, it kind of devastated a lot of the musicians, devastated from what I could see a lot of the culture. Young people were kind of got lost through the use of that. But also it created some great art, and it also created something that allowed us to kind of expand our consciousness and become aware of things beyond just the materialistic, mundane, everyday, consumeristic society, which America and Europe to a large extent were becoming. So it's the shadow side is necessary. You know, as the German philosopher Hegel would see it as, you know, with that there's a growth and something, a third thing comes out of that, something grows out of that. But also with that shadow side, I think, you know, there are they're in a sense forces that we're aware of around us. They're not necessarily brought about by one particular person or group of people, although sometimes that can come through those people, that those forces can come through those people, like I think it did with the Beatles. I think they were just a spiritual force was working through those four individuals together, you know. And I think they became more and more conscious of those forces working through them, and you can see how they, by the end of their career, are trying to nearly kind of work with those forces. I mean, they're aware of them, and they constantly talk about these things that, you know, the songs come from some other place, or you know, there's this kind of religious, esoteric aspect to their interviews after about 66, 67, which LSD brings, and their trip to India also brings that. But in regards to Tavistock and things like that, I think there are, just as the Beatles and the groups around that time in the mid-60s, late 60s, started to become more conscious of who they were, aware of what was happening, of how they were changing things, of where their music was coming from, and started to work with it on a more conscious level. I think there are groups of people that are aware of things that are coming down the line. They're aware of what they need, what needs to be done to change, to how do you say, guide those things in order for certain results to come about that are favourable to those groups. So that's a negative thing, in my opinion, because it's consciously manipulating things in a way that is not often done with the awareness of the people that they're trying to manipulate. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do.
So there is quite a large and quite, I think, substantial amount of evidence to suggest that though this LSD culture kind of flowered, and it seemed to be a natural evolution from, if you can imagine, where could the Beatles go after the first initial years of Beatlemania and the mop top and stuff like that? I mean, it had to go somewhere else. And when they met Bob Dylan and he introduced them to marijuana, and you suddenly had this emergence of rock and roll or pop music with this kind of folk, thoughtful, intellectual type of lyric. And suddenly you got a new whole type of genre of music. So you can see that, I think, with the Beatles when they move into their rubber soul, their kind of maybe Help, Rubber Soul, Revolver period. And then that accelerates into LSD because they're suddenly aware of a different state of consciousness with the marijuana. And then somehow into the culture creeps LSD, and it's given to them, the Beatles, by accident. So there's a kind of an organic thing in a way that happens and accidentally enters into their life. Now, they were given it by a particular individual who may have done that on purpose, to kind of get them interested in it. But they did absorb it into their music, and then that led the music to go a different direction. And then it led, because they were kind of leaders of 60s culture, that led into the culture and other music like Hendrix or later Pink Floyd and stuff, this kind of psychedelic period. And so, etc. So it's an organic growth. But I think somewhere along the way there seems to have been groups of people who were aware of things that were happening. Definitely with the LSD, there were a number of people behind introducing it into the culture for very particular reasons, which seem to be quite nefarious as far as I can tell. So in the book, the title of the book with, the religious, occult and esoteric world of the Beatles, I kind of use that word occult, even though it's not the right way to use the word occult, because the occult really just means things that are secret, But I think if things are kept, in this day and age, if things are kept secret from people, it tends to be not so good, because we're in a period of where we should be more mature and responsible about things. So keeping information from us is like keeping, it's okay to keep information from children because it might harm them. So I think occult schools in the past kept information from us when we were maybe not, in a sense. So, we're in a democracy now, the world of democracy, which means we can take part in our own governance. So we've been given that responsibility. So keep things secret from us anymore. It's not really, we're not in that cultural period anymore. That was something from the past. So it's like a child becoming an adult. You don't keep secrets from them, or you tell them, silly things that aren't true. You have to tell them, you have to give them the facts and let them make up their own mind about it, in a sense. But that's another issue, because we're also in a culture where we're not being taught anymore. I really feel we've been taught not to think, even though we have this ability to think and we have freedom to think, and we're supposed to be told to think and learn how to think. In actual fact, we're kind of being denied that a lot through many different forms. And there seems to be a suggestion that LSD was a kind of a start to really disaffect people's ability to think. And there is I think there's some truth to that. So I know I'm kind of rambling on.
No, not at all. But I have a couple of questions for you. I have a couple of questions. One is because you say that we should have access to both sides of that we should have access to occult information and make up our own minds.